In the Old West, survival was not something people watched on television. It was part of daily life. A family could live days away from the nearest town, weeks away from reliable help, and one bad storm away from real danger. If the fire went out, if the food spoiled, or if the water turned unsafe, there was no emergency service waiting nearby. There was only knowledge, patience, and whatever the land could provide. Pioneer families did not survive because life was easy. They survived because they learned how to solve problems before those problems became deadly. They knew how to keep food through winter, make light from animal fat, start fires without matches, and read signs in nature that many people today would never notice. These were not hobbies. They were everyday skills that helped families cross plains, settle homesteads, and endure some of the hardest conditions in American history. 1. Banking the fire. Before matches became cheap and easy to find, letting the fire go out was a serious mistake. In many frontier homes, the fire was kept alive day and night, because starting over from nothing took time, effort, and dry materials that were not always available. At night, families covered hot coals with ash, so the embers would stay alive until morning. When the house woke up, those hidden coals could be uncovered, fed with dry kindling, and brought back to life. It saved time, saved energy, and made cold mornings far easier to face. To modern people, this may sound like a small habit, but to pioneers, keeping fire alive meant warmth, cooked food, boiled water, and safety. The fire was the heart of the home, and protecting it was one of the first survival lessons every family understood. And once warmth was secured, the next concern was keeping food safe without electricity. 2. The root cellar. Long before refrigerators stood in every kitchen, pioneer families relied on the ground itself to protect their food. A root cellar used the steady coolness of the earth to store potatoes, carrots, onions, apples, and other foods for months at a time. This simple underground room could help a family survive winter without depending on town stores or fresh deliveries. The food stored there represented months of labor from the garden and fields. If it spoiled, the family lost more than food. They lost security. The root cellar worked because it used nature instead of machinery. It stayed cool when the weather was hot and protected food when the surface world froze. In a frontier life where every harvest mattered, that quiet room beneath the ground was one of the most important places on the homestead. But food storage was only part of the story. Families also needed a way to make bread when store-bought yeast was nowhere to be found. 3. The sourdough jar. On the frontier, a jar of sourdough starter was more than a kitchen ingredient. It was a living supply of bread, biscuits, pancakes, and simple meals that could continue for years if cared for properly. Families fed the starter with flour and water, keeping it alive through travel, winter, and isolation. In places where yeast packets were unavailable and bakeries were far away, sourdough gave people a reliable way to turn basic flour into filling food. The value of this skill was not just in the bread itself. It was in the independence it created. As long as a family had flour, water, and a healthy starter, they had a way to keep baking. For pioneers, that kind of reliability mattered more than convenience. And when the sun went down, food was not the only problem. A dark cabin needed light. 4. Tallow candles and lamps. Before electric lights, many frontier families made their own light from animal fat. After butchering, fat could be rendered and turned into candles or simple lamps. Nothing useful was wasted because every part of an animal had value. Tallow candles were not fancy, but they gave families hours of light after sunset. That light allowed people to cook, mend clothes, read, care for children, and continue working after the day outside had ended. In a world without switches or batteries, light had to be made by hand. A candle was not just a household object. It was time, labor, and security turned into flame. The same resourcefulness that kept a cabin lit also helped families preserve one of their most valuable foods. 5. Salt-cured jerky. Cured. Fresh meat could spoil quickly without refrigeration, so pioneers had to preserve it before it was lost. One of the most reliable methods was turning lean meat into jerky through salt, drying, and patience. Jerky was valuable because it was light, portable, and could last far longer than fresh meat. Travelers carried it on long journeys. Families stored it for hard seasons. Hunters used it when they could not return home quickly. This skill mattered because meat represented effort. An animal taken during a hunt could feed a family only if it was handled properly. Drying and salting gave people a way to stretch that food into the future. But pioneers did not stop at simple dried meat. Some survival foods were built to carry even more energy in a smaller form. 6. Pemmican. Long before protein bars, survival rations, and packaged emergency food, frontier travelers relied on something remarkably simple. Pemmican combined dried meat, rendered fat, and sometimes dried berries into a dense food that could last for years under the right conditions. Explorers, traders, hunters, and pioneers valued pemmican because it packed enormous energy into a small space. A person could carry enough food for days without hauling heavy supplies. On long journeys across the plains, that advantage often made the difference between comfort and hardship. What made pemmican so remarkable was its simplicity. It required no refrigeration, no special storage, and very little maintenance once prepared. For people living far from towns and supply chains, it was one of the closest things to a perfect survival food. While pemmican traveled with people, another forgotten frontier invention stayed close to home and helped keep fresh food from spoiling. 7. The spring house. Not every homestead had access to a cold spring, but those that did possessed something incredibly valuable. By building a small structure over flowing spring water, families created a natural cooling system long before electricity arrived. Milk, butter, cheese, and other foods could be stored in the cool environment created by constantly moving water. The temperature remains surprisingly stable throughout the year, helping preserve food when summer heat threatened to spoil it. The spring house demonstrated something pioneers understood well. Nature often provided solutions if people paid attention. Rather than fighting the environment, they learned how to work with it. A flowing stream could become a refrigerator without consuming a single piece of fuel. But even families with spring houses still needed reliable foods that could survive long journeys and difficult winters. 8. Hardtack. Few foods have a reputation as tough as hardtack. Made from little more than flour, water, and salt, these hard biscuits became a staple for soldiers, settlers, and travelers throughout the 19th century. Hardtack was not famous for its flavor. It was famous for its durability. Properly stored, it could last for years without spoiling. That reliability made it invaluable during long wagon journeys when fresh bread simply was not an option. For pioneers, food was judged less by convenience and more by dependability. Hardtack provided calories when other foods failed. It could travel across mountains, deserts, and prairies without refrigeration or special care. By this point, frontier families had learned how to preserve food in remarkable ways. But food alone was not enough. Every homestead also depended on one skill that made nearly everything else possible. The pioneers who settled the American frontier understood that survival required more than stored food. They needed fire, clean water, shelter, and practical knowledge that could not be purchased in a store. Some of the next skills were so effective that modern survival experts still teach versions of them today. 9. Flint and steel fire making. Before disposable lighters and waterproof matches, many people carried a simple fire kit wherever they traveled. A piece of flint, a steel striker, and a small amount of charred cloth were often enough to create a flame. The process required practice, but it offered something valuable: reliability. A person who understood flint and steel could create fire almost anywhere with a little patience. Unlike modern tools, it did not depend on fuel canisters, batteries, or manufactured chemicals. Fire meant warmth, cooked food, boiled water, and protection. It allowed families to survive winter nights and travelers to cross unfamiliar territory. Knowing how to create it from basic materials was considered essential knowledge, and once a fire was burning, pioneers often used it to preserve one of their most important food supplies. 10. The smokehouse. Behind many frontier homes stood a small building dedicated to preserving food. The smokehouse transformed fresh meat into a resource that could last far beyond the hunting season or butchering day. Slow smoke and careful preparation helped protect meat from spoilage while adding flavor at the same time. Hams, bacon, fish, and sausages could hang for weeks while the preservation process worked its quiet magic. The smokehouse represented long-term thinking. Families were not preparing for tomorrow's meal. They were preparing for the months ahead. Every successful harvest or hunt needed a way to survive the future. And while meat filled the smokehouse, orchards provided another opportunity to prepare for winter. 11 sun-dried fruit. When apple, peach, and pear trees produced more fruit than a family could eat fresh, pioneers turned to one of the oldest preservation methods in human history. They simply used the sun. Slices of fruit were carefully arranged and allowed to dry slowly until much of their moisture disappeared. The result was lighter, sweeter, and far easier to store through the winter months. Dried fruit offered something precious during long, cold seasons. It provided variety. Months after harvest ended, families could still enjoy the flavors of summer. In a time when fresh produce was not available year-round, that mattered more than many people realize. But preserving food was only useful if people also had safe water to drink. 12 charcoal water filters. Clean water was essential on the frontier, and pioneers often improved muddy or unpleasant water using simple filters made from gravel, sand, and charcoal. These materials helped remove dirt and improve taste using resources found almost anywhere. Interestingly, charcoal is still used in many modern filtration systems today. The technology may have changed, but the basic idea remains the same. Sometimes the oldest solutions continue to work surprisingly well. But water was not the only challenge. Illness and injury could be just as dangerous when help was far away. 13. Willow bark medicine. Long before aspirin became common, many frontier families relied on willow bark to help relieve pain and fever. The knowledge was passed down through generations and became an important part of frontier life. People learned which plants could help and which should be avoided. In remote areas where doctors were scarce, understanding nature often became a valuable survival skill. And just as pioneers learned to read plants, they also learned to read the sky. 14. Reading the weather. Before weather forecasts existed, families watched clouds, wind, birds, and animal behavior to predict changing conditions. These observations helped farmers, hunters, and travelers prepare before storms arrived. The skill was built on experience rather than guesswork. People who spent years outdoors learned to recognize patterns that often signaled rain, cold fronts, or changing weather. And perhaps no observation was more valuable than knowing where to find water. Finding water from nature. For pioneers crossing the American West, finding water could mean the difference between success and disaster. Experienced travelers watched birds, animal trails, trees, and the landscape itself for clues that pointed toward the hidden springs and streams. More than anything, this skill reflected a deep understanding of nature. Earlier generations learned that the land was constantly providing information to those willing to pay attention. The pioneers who settled the American frontier survived through knowledge, preparation, and resourcefulness. They preserved food, found water, created light, and solved problems using simple skills passed down through generations. Technology has changed the way we live, but these forgotten survival techniques remind us of an important lesson. Sometimes the most valuable tool is not what you own, it is what you know.